cannot tell you how happy I am to be here. And I'm even happier to be introduced to my good friend Jim Brown. Dr. Brown taught at Samford for years and years and years. He grew up in Cookeville, Tennessee. He's a graduate of Tennessee Tech, and he got his MA and his PhD from Vanderbilt University. He studied European and East Asian history at Vanderbilt, and he wrote his dissertation on Russian intellectual history of the 19th century, which, as I've said to many of you, is about that wide right there. Is that fair, Jim?
You're talking about the topic, not the dissertation?
For years and years and years, I hung my courses on what terrified students used to refer to as Brown's model of nationalism. Well, this is Brown. And he's going to talk to us today about something that's completely different. He taught at Samford for a number of years, and he discovered Alabama. I've read dozens and dozens of books in the last several years. This one is the best title of any book that I have seen, for it describes exactly what happened to him right after he moved to Alabama and started teaching at Samford. Thank you all so very much. Jim Brown.
I appreciate being invited today. My good friend Bob England, it always worries you a little when somebody knows you too well who introduces you what they're going to tell, but I appreciate what he didn't say as well. I thank everybody who put this program together. I met Ninan, and we have J.D. Wilson, has been the newish director for University of Alabama Press, has been kind enough to bring some books. So what I would like to do is tell you just a little bit about myself, why a European Asian historian has written a book on Alabama. It's not exactly the credentials you would expect. I grew up in Cookeville. My father was an engineering prof and later dean, and I was going to be an engineer. There was never any doubt about it, right up through sophomore year in college. The Tennessee State Science Fair was held when I was 16 years old. I won the boys division with a cross between a computer and a calculator. It had diodes that would light up for 1 and go out for 0 with my binary language. They input it with a little telephone, old rotary telephone dial. And if I had stayed with that computer thing, I would be living in a better house or houses today. But when I got to college, the 60s came along. The flower children were budding out. Southeast Asia was heating up. 4 little black girls killed in a bombing in Birmingham. And I can show you the step on the library step I was standing on when I heard about JFK's assassination. And nobody was talking about that in engineering, but they were in history and poli-sci. So to my father's puzzlement, but he was supportive, I switched to history. And looking back, I was taking the most exotic courses I could take just to kind of get some perspective on the craziness that was the 60s. And the most exotic course Tennessee Tech offered was a 3-quarter sequence in Russian history, taught by a Polish professor. So I signed on, went on to grad school, and in graduate school, I guess the most interesting discovery I made, which Bob has already alluded to, were I squeezed a 3-year PhD program into 5 years at Vanderbilt. And my biggest discoveries were what the world of ideas, these weightless, ephemeral things, did to change human behavior. Like in the Enlightenment, you have this crazy idea that all you had to do to make civilization harmonious all over the world was to totally redo every political and social institution to match human nature, a fairly rosy view of human nature. Diderot probably said it best, the history of all misery is the conflict of natural man with artificial institutions. Now, is that the bluest of blue sky proposals you ever heard? To totally reform every institution? And yet we in the United States are a kind of an exemplar of that in the world. And a lot of the countries, like modern Britain, France, of course, in the Revolution, United States, came out of the Enlightenment. But many more states came out of the Romantic era, Romanticism. And so I guess my biggest discovery in grad school was that the Grimm's brothers were not these harmless avuncular types who collected tales for children. They were high-pressure scholars. Jakob Grimm had a working knowledge of 70 languages. He was in on the sort of invention of philology, this love of languages and the origin of words. They were out collecting folk tales because they believed folk tales held bits and pieces of the ancient culture. And all you had to do to be successful and revive your country in the modern world was to revive those ancient patterns of behavior. And they thought they found pieces of them in the folk tales. Just as crazy, right? And yet, many more countries in the modern world were created on this folklore to nationalism model. You must begin with an identifiable group of people. Language is the best identifier, religion is a close second, minor stuff like occupations, clothes, skin color. But if both language and religion set you apart, you've got a pretty good foundation. And then there's a negative stimulus, and there's a cultural response, and then you have a new kind of political nationalism informed by this cultural nationalism. So this was my, and finally, after 40 some years teaching, I finally produced a textbook in 2014. The title of the textbook was Fairy Tales, Patriotism and the Nation State, The Rise of the Modern West and the Response of the World, parentheses, with Google Earth folder for each chapter. Even the title was too long. It was 606 pages, no pictures, so when I go back and look at it. But after I got that finally done, then I had time to do what had happened kind of to me in Alabama. Because when I came to Alabama, I was just 200 straight line miles from my home, but it was a different terrain. It was a different culture. And I had the kind of energy you have in your mid-20s, looking back on that fondly. And I was an outdoors, I was an avid fisherman and a canoer and worked with youth groups in terms of outdoor things. I was an amateur herpetologist, and so here was a whole new world for me to explore. And I guess I was supposed to be a Russian history specialist, but I was not a Russian history specialist for a couple of reasons. One is that the history department was fairly small, and there are only 2 of us in the department to teach non-American history. I mean, the entire recorded history of the world. So I could only teach Russian history once every 2 or 3 years, as opposed to my counterpart at UAB who taught every semester and traveled there on a regular basis. So, and then I worked up lots and lots of different non-Western courses in the Middle East, and of course I was doing East Asia and African history, and then got into folklore. Because the first few years I was in Alabama, I discovered how to make white oak baskets at the hands of an old timer, how to tie nets, particularly hook nets, from commercial fishermen out on the Coosa. I was given old toys that turned out to be ancient tools, like a Native American pump drill that was considered to be just a pioneer toy. And so all this stuff was my path back to American culture through folklore. And by 1973, 74, my second and third years at Samford, I was already teaching our January term course in folklore. My first folklore course was from Grimm's to Hitler, in terms of the invention of folklore in Germany, and then the abuse of it by use and abuse of folklore, you might call it. But it gradually, folklore had such a universal thing, so many American examples, that this was my path kind of back to American culture. So the course evolved into every second year full semester course with 1/3 folk music, 1/3 folk craft, 1/3 folk literature or orature, this kind of thing. And this is really where the book came from. And there are 12 chapters in the book on 12 different topics, more or less. And the topics are arranged in the book as in when I first had a close encounter with that particular topic. The very first topic is the Cahaba River and all that happened to it in terms of Cahaba River Society and the lawsuit against the Jefferson County, the bankruptcy of same, and lots of things about that. But it started because 3 days after we got to Birmingham, we moved down in a U-Haul rental van, and I had my 15-year-old brother-in-law helping move. And after 2 days, we had outlived our usefulness, and were given time to go fishing. And we went looking for a creek with shoals and pools. We wanted to fish with hellgrammites, like we fished with the larva of the big Dobson fly. It looks like a flattened black rubber caterpillar from hell. It's one of the ugliest creatures you've seen. But we wanted to find a place we could do that. So we headed to Chevy 2 as directly away from downtown Birmingham as we could judge. And at every intersection, took the low road on the theory that rivers run the low ground. And we found the Cahaba River. And I have probably been in the Cahaba, or canoeing on it, once a quarter now for 50 years. And I've seen the sorts of natural history things anybody does who goes to the same natural environment year after year and in all seasons. So that's chapter 1. And then chapter 2, I joined the local herpetology society, which met on, I came as a professional historian and amateur herpetologist, and they met on Sanford campus. So it was a really colorful group of amateur collectors, mostly interested in snakes. But they taught me about the spotted salamander migration off that hill opposite where Sanford is today, in some rainy night in February, to go to the ponds to do their little breeding dance. And so just like Saturday before last, Homewood had its annual Salamander Festival in the Homewood High School gym, where one of my finest days of my year when I get to show little kids salamanders and let them hold them, you know. So that whole chapter and how Friends of Shades Creek came about, and that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is on a structure for which a ritzy Birmingham neighborhood is named. It's called Ross Bridge. It's not a bridge at all, it's a culvert. And it was done by hand by slave labor in 1963 and 64. And that was proved by Margie White of the Birmingham Historical Society in this wonderful series of explorations. And I'd been in Birmingham 2 years when I was out blackberry picking out on the railroad track. And some old timer said, "Have you heard about this slave-built culvert out at Ways in the Woods?" And I said no, and he offered to take me to it. And as I said in the book, being of the age of innocence and invulnerability, immortality, I went with him. And it was incredible. And the history of that, and how the neighborhood grew and how the history was formed. There's a chapter on Red Horse, founding the old timers who actually noosed the Red Horse with a wire snare, and have done this for a century that I know of, probably a Native American technique. There's a chapter on the Great Shoal Fish Trap, where when the drum especially have been upriver and they've spawned, laid their eggs, and then on the first hard rain after spawning, they're all coming downriver in a 4-hour to 24-hour period. And they had a lot of creeks still have these V-shaped rock dams. That's all that's left. That was to V the water into a trap. The Native Americans used a big basket to catch the fish in, loosely woven basket. It could be 6 feet at the mouth and 15 feet long. But Europeans, with their sawn technology, came in and had wooden slats with a drop, and then wooden slats and a drop, and wooden slats that, as the river rose, you could catch fish until the river rose over the top of the trap. And I found the guy. These things have been illegal since 1920, but I found a guy in 1981 who still ran one and did an interview with him. And the very last chapter is on railroad culling. The Gandhi dancers, the folks who took charge of 15 or 20 miles of track, and half of their job was to line that track. They had to grass it with shovels to get the grass out of it. They had to keep the ballast full and tight under the cross ties. They had to swap the old rotted cross ties out. They had to turn worn rails or across them, and they had to have a singer for safety and to kind of enliven for the amusement of the boys, is the way John Mealing put it to me. So I found probably the last of those collars. Mechanization began to do away with that in the 1950s, and by the 1970s it was pretty well gone. He retired in 72, and I caught up with him in 1982 and did the best oral interviews I ever did. But you had half of a given day in blazing and breathless summer or cold and rainy winter, you had to line that track because the trains then and now move the track, the two rails and the cross ties they're spiked down to through the gravel. And so there's some up and down, you had to jack them up and cram the gravel under, but mostly side-to-side alignment. And they used about a 20-pound heavy straight lining bar with their hands back like this, and they all had to move at the same time. And what was more important than the brute strength any person put into it was the timing of the chant. And so the singer would start out with a couplet, and when he would first start singing, you'd hear this ragged clack as they'd all tip their big levers on the track. And then as you got toward the end of the two-line couplet, it just sounded like one bar hitting the track. And then come on, move it, boys, pull. And the third beat you'd pull, and then they'd step back on the fourth. But oh, my wife need a hat, and my baby needs shoes. Come on, Dice, and give me 2 twos. Boys, can you move it? Boys, can you move it? Got my learning on number 4. Boys, I'm telling you, I'm ready to go. Boys, can you move it? I got a gal, her name is Kate, moving in her hip like a Cadillac 8. Boys, can you move it? When I die, please bury me deep. Jug of molasses at my feet. 1,000 biscuits in my hand, gonna sop my way to the promised land. Boys, can you move it? It was to keep everybody uplifted, and then when you had to lift, the rails came in 39-foot sections, and they were 90 pounds to the yard or 132 pounds to the yard. So you got 12 guys picking up a 1,300-pound rail, and you had to have a collar for safety. If you thought the rail was going from you, they picked it up with these rail dogs. They had pairs. If you thought the rail was going from you and stepped toward it, and 11 other guys thought it was coming towards you, you were going to get 1,300 pounds set on your leg, guaranteed to break it, at least in one place. He went on to Carnegie Hall to do his railroad calling once he got discovered. That was one of my finest moments. I was the discoverer of John Mealing. He was born within sight of the tracks in Whitehall, down in Lowndes County. And when they asked him for a middle name for the form, he put Henry, John Henry Mealing. And he said later on, there never was but one John Henry on the railroad, and that was me. But that's the last chapter. When I started, I've done books before, textbooks and anthologies, but never a book that you'd do a book talk for an audience. And Wayne Flint, most of you will know, who's done lots and lots of this, Wayne said, Jim, he said, you need to read a little passage so they know the flavor of the prose. So let me take a middle chapter in the book, and I want to read you the first couple of pages in the last paragraph or so. I was surprised the University Press let me get by with such casual writing. J.D. wasn't in charge then. He might be stricter now, but so the chapter is called "What Wondrous Love Is This? Sacred Harp Singing." If you're a regular in the sacred harp singing world, you won't need to read this chapter. In fact, I'd rather you didn't, because you'd probably point out sins of omission and commission for me to correct. But if you know about sacred harp only casually or not at all, let me introduce you to one of the most interesting cultural traditions of the Piedmont South, the center of gravity of which is surely North and Central Alabama. 1974, I went to my first fa sol la singing, an all-day singing and dinner on the grounds of the 4-shaped note variety. I'd been in the state 3 years by this time, and several friends who knew of my folkloric interest urged me to go. I was reluctant to go hear what I figured would be hokey backwoods music in a dour and fundamentalist setting, but a couple of faculty friends had never been to one either, so we marshaled our collective courage and picked the closest scheduled singing we could find. It was at the Hopewell Primitive Baptist Church, a few miles south of Oneonta, Blount County, Alabama. Just go and get it over with so I could say I'd tried it. That was my less than positive mood of the day. Before we could even see the church building, we found cars parked bumper to bumper on both sides of the two-lane country blacktop. We found a place to park ours and began to walk toward the little one-room church. The singing had already started, and as we got closer to the building, you could feel the pulse of the song, incredible volume coming out of that little wooden church building. I was the first of the three of us up the front steps, and when I opened the church door, I was caught in waves of sound as if I were standing in a surf. I just froze for a minute. They were singing in a haunting minor key, throats open in full volume. They sang with no tremolo or vibrato to speak of, but with perfect chords from a piercing high harmony to the deepest bass section I ever heard outside a Russian Orthodox church. In front of us, there was a short center aisle, and on the left and right, a few rows of pews facing the pulpit, or the spot where the pulpit would have been in an ordinary church service. In the front half or more of the church, though, the main aisle was blocked. There, the pews and chairs were arranged on four sides, all facing the center where the leader of each song stood. You could only get in on the corners of the square. There were a couple of folks near the front right corner of the church who were in charge of calling on singers to lead, apparently only one song per leader since the church was full. Often the leaders who got up would say they wanted to sing such and such a number in memory of older relatives or friends, those too sick to attend or those who had already passed on, whose favorite song that had been. Some specialist in the middle of the front row would pitch or key the song. There are no musical instruments in this tradition. The song leader would bring a right hand down to start the music, and off they'd go. Everyone had a hardcover songbook wider than it was tall, but it was obvious that not many needed theirs. They knew their parts of the songs by heart, sometimes all 5 or more verses. We stayed through the noon hour dinner on the grounds, then on through the 2-hour-long sessions after lunch. At the end of that second hour after lunch, the chooser of leaders asked us all to stand and then called on Uncle Jimmy, apparently the oldest man present, to conclude with prayer. He came slowly and haltingly up to the front and began by allowing as how this could be his last singing there ever, and looking at him, I thought the chances of that were quite good. Then he began to pray, soon getting into that backcountry sermon and prayer rhythm in which every phrase ends in a powerful ha or ah with a pause before the next phrase. He really got wound up, and the prayer went on and on. But then something unusual happened I later learned was called singing the preacher down. Somewhere in the middle of the church, someone started softly humming a hymn. The humming gradually spread, and then as the words began to be used and as the volume of the singers rose, the volume of Uncle Jimmy's prayer dwindled and he brought it to a close. And then, still singing, the members of the congregation began leaving the church, hugging everybody close to them on the way out. There weren't many dry eyes, including mine, and I didn't even know these people. That was 60% of my lifetime ago, a lifetime stretching now beyond the biblical norm of 70, and I still remember it as if it were last week. And for this chapter, as the other chapters, there's some research that went into this later. I talk about Carl Karmer's chapter. He's got a 10-page chapter on going up to a fossilized singing on Sound Mountain around or about 1925. And then if you're a historian, you have the bias that you think you can learn things about something that nobody else can learn by watching how it came into being. So the reaction of any historian to something puzzling is to go see how it got to be that way. And this led me to the works of George Pullen Jackson. He was born in 1974. He's a great phrase maker, and my favorite book on Sacred Harp is still the one he wrote back in 1933, White Spirituals from the Southern Uplands. He's a great phrase maker. He came from Maine. He was born in Maine, what he calls the Deep North. And when he was 13, his father moved to booming industrial city in the South, Birmingham. Spent his teen years in Birmingham, and then went on to Vanderbilt to undergraduate school. He studied German and classical music, went to Dresden to study both, wound up back teaching German language, head of the German department at Vanderbilt, until retired in 1943. And but it kind of did me good to see that his passion in life was writing about Sacred Heart music, not German studies. So that seemed to excuse me from backing off on Russian studies. And then there's I met, back in the 1970s and 80s when I was first doing it, I met Buell Cobb, who's kind of the great modern writer on this. He was working at South Central Bell, and a friend who I'd drugged to the singing over in Talladega Forest every year. I met Buell and got his take on. He's got a book in 1978 and another one in 2013. Just a wonderful count. And then I met David Ivey. I used to take my folklore classes up to Pine Grove Church on Lookout Mountain, down south of Collinsville. And David Ivey was one of those singing families from Sand Mountain that the family can field a whole church full of singers. And he was one of the old heads who would key the songs on the front. David Ivey today is head of the Alabama Folklife Association. But he has put together a Camp Fasola. And it's like a modern version of the old singing schools that you used to have in the summertime. In 1980, the National Sacred Harp Convention met for the very first time on Sanford campus. Our music dean got interested in it, and I was one of the few faculty members outside the School of Music to get interested. And it was really neat to go. They put these singers up on stage as if it were performance music, which is a little awkward. It's participatory music. You're supposed to be in the middle of that square and singing it. And one of the days of that 4-day singing, much to my surprise, here comes this black delegation from Ozark, Alabama. I'd never seen a single black person go to these, quote, white spiritual singing. And here's a whole delegation, and they were not new converts. Their community had a quote, colored sacred harp book in 1934. And so and the best singer of the group, it's an incredible voice. As a music faculty member remarked to me, he could vocally etch his initials on the balcony in that series. So anyway, and there are pictures of the Denson brothers memorial stone in front of the county courthouse at Winston County Courthouse in Double Springs. There's pictures of dinner on the grounds at Sacred Harp. Let me read you the last little bit that goes with this. I drop in and out of the Fasola world, but I seem to need a regular fix, a dose of the vibrant musical and spiritual tradition that calibrates some sort of reset in my behavior and activities. So on June 15 and 16, 2017, Thursday and Friday morning, I made it to a couple sessions of the National Convention being held that year in Fultondale. I sat in the back row of the bass section. On the first morning, the fellow to my left was from Burlington, Vermont. The fellow to my right was from Decatur, Georgia, and had come straight from Camp Fasola. The fellow in front of me, also a Brown, Ted Brown, was from Derby, England. And when a woman named Brown was introduced to lead a song and introduced it with an English accent, I tapped Ted on the shoulder and asked whether they were related. "She's me wife," said he. I assume this is the Helen Brown named as point of contact from Mapperley Village Parish Church. There were some decidedly modern touches in this iteration of an old rural tradition I had first encountered 43 years before in a one-room wooden church building without electricity or modern plumbing, with wooden shutters instead of glazed windows, with dirt dauber nests up in the corners of the ceiling. Now there were cell phones going off with exotic ringtones in the pockets and purses of some who'd forgotten to mute theirs. The chairman read text off an iPhone about the medical condition of a woman who'd fallen off a golf cart at the singing the day before, and the chairman thanked whomever it was who had brought a tray of baklava for the coffee and dessert tables outside the main hall. I immediately tried to envision baklava on the dinner on the grounds table at Pine Grove Church and couldn't do it. But the music was essentially true to its roots, enchanting all the singers who, as one veteran singer once put it to me, sing not for an audience, but for other singers. The fellowship was just as warm and caring as always. On the way back to the car, I passed a woman running to grab something out of her car to take back inside, apparently trying to lock it and failing in her hurry, and then just slamming the door without taking time to lock it. We looked at each other and laughed, and each said something about not having to worry about locking your car at a Sacred Harp singing. What wondrous love is this? Anyway, this is a book. It's a collection of 12 chapters like that, based on things that happened to me the first 10, 12 years I was in Alabama, but researched and kind of bringing you up to date on the topic if it needed to bring in. Some of the things are, like one of the chapters is on the Audubon Mountain Workshop. The Audubon Society, mainly based in Birmingham back then, for 40 years had a workshop up at Alpine Camp for Boys about 4 miles south of Mentone. And it best collection of natural historians in 7 states. I thought, yeah, a nucleus of biologists and then all kinds of hobbyists, and they even invited the occasional folklorist to come talk about the culture. You know? And I wrote the chapter as an advertisement to spread the word about this. And but COVID and then the Audubon Society had new direction, sort of killed it off. So it turns out to be a memoriam instead of an advertisement. And it's heavy on natural history. If you're not really interested in natural history, it might not be your book. I was having coffee recently with 3 friends, all of us. Have you heard of Romeo, retired old men eating out? We were, and I asked them. I said, "Do you know how clams and mussels get upstream?" And the answer is really fascinating. They can use that muscle to pull themselves through sand and gravel, but they couldn't get up a 2-inch rock ledge. Why aren't they all and their babies all washed down to the Gulf? Well, they have these egg sacs that are designed to look like minnows or aquatic insects, and when say a bass will bite it, these little larvae will swarm out and grab on the gills of the fish and hang on as parasites for a few weeks, and they got a 50-50 chance of dropping off upstream or downstream. I thought it was just fascinating. But when I said, "Have you ever wondered how mussels get upstream?" the other 3 sides of the table erupted in hilarious laughter. This is not the sort of thing that kept them up nights. So this is partly memoir, partly history.